Well, good evening, Forest Mill. It's good to be with you on this beautiful Wednesday night. I hope that you are enjoying this taste of spring we're getting here and seeing the beautiful flowers that are out there and the grass and the trees. Everything's kind of coming into green, and it's just really beautiful time of the year. It was especially beautiful this past Sunday, I thought. Our time together on Easter. My wife, I didn't say this on Sunday because I didn't want to distract anybody, but my wife at one point said, we really should just made this a singing service, which I think was a really big compliment on Tommy's job of leading us in worship, and not at all a slight on the job the preacher does. But anyway, it was just a great Sunday. It was good to see some faces that we haven't seen in a while, and good to have family in. And the Easter egg hunt was just great. And the people organizing that, Lori Holt and her crew, did a fantastic job. And I got through Sunday. I'm usually tired after Easter Sunday, and I was tired for this one. But I just remember how blessed I felt. After Sunday morning, it was just kind of a high. But we come to this week's psalm, and it is definitely not a high. It's a low. It's Psalm 120, and you would think that Psalm 120 would be a high note. You would think it would be really encouraging, and because it's a song of ascents. In other words, it's a psalm that was meant to be sung as you were going to the feast days, whether you were going for Passover or Feast of Tabernacles or whatever feast day you were attending in Jerusalem. You would sing this song, and other psalms were traditionally sung on the journey, the Song of Ascents. And so you would think, everybody's feeling good. It's like when your family is heading out on vacation, right? You're going to the beach, or you're going to the mountains, or you're going to Disney World, or wherever it is your family really likes to go. And that feeling of elation that you get when you're on the journey there. Now, on the way home, it's a different story, but on the journey there, everybody's excited. Everybody's looking forward to this great time, this momentous occasion, whatever that might be. And so we tend to gravitate towards upbeat music and upbeat conversation and upbeat topics of discussion, right? It's just a really positive time. So why would they be singing this psalm when going to a feast day? This psalm, which begins talking about slander and it closes by talking about war. Why was it written? What's the occasion? What's the psalm's purpose? So obviously we don't have a lot of background. We don't know who wrote the psalm or any of the situation around it. But the fact that it was called a Psalm of Ascents gives us a little bit of insight. Likely this was written by someone who couldn't go, someone who had to stay home because of the troubles that they're facing within this discussed in this psalm. They were unable to leave to go to the feast day. And so this is it's a psalm of sadness because they didn't get to go. And the other people who are going, they sing it to remember the people who couldn't go. In other words, it's a time when even the people who are experiencing, mountaintop type experiences, is what we always call them, that even the people who are experiencing these mountaintop life experiences can remember those who aren't able to be there with them. It's like sitting down to a vast spread of feast, Thanksgiving Day or Christmas Day, and remembering to pray for the cold and the hungry. It's like getting a promotion and having many of your financial problems answered, and remembering to pray for those who are still stuck in poverty. Right. So this is what we believe to be the what's going on here in this Psalm 120. And it's a reminder to those people who are going on the journey to be mindful of those who couldn't come, but also to bring some of the blessing back, right? To come back and give some of that goodness to the people who missed out. And much like we at Forest Mill, we really encourage our members to give, not for the sake of the church budget or for any big glamorous things, but rather because it's good for the poor who need help, and it's good for us to be givers, right? We need, in our times of blessing, we need to remember those who are struggling. So anyway, what do we do when we are struggling, when there are circumstances that we're going through that we don't have any control over? We kind of see that as we go through this particular psalm. So let's begin just by reading the first couple of verses, Psalm 120, verses 1 and 2. I call on the Lord in my distress, and he answers me. Save me, Lord, from lying lips and deceitful tongues. Wow. What do you do when you are being talked about in untrue ways, when lies are going on around you? Well, I think the first thing we have to do is acknowledge that we don't have any control over that. There's nothing we can do to make people stop talking bad about us. We can do good. We can be kind. We can answer the questions of those who ask. But we cannot make people tell or believe the truth. That is just beyond our abilities. And often, while we may not understand that specific circumstance, I'll bet you do know what it's like to struggle with a problem that is too big for you. Something that you have no power or control over. It could be physical or emotional or mental illness. Right? It's not something you can just fix yourself. And sometimes it's not even something that medical professionals can fix. Maybe you know what it's like to be caught in financial struggles. And you're working as hard as you can work, and you're saving as hard as you can save, and you just can't get out of the hole. Or maybe it's problems in a relationship. You're being the best husband or wife or son or daughter or mother or father. Is particularly difficult sometimes, and you're doing the best you can in that relationship, and it's just not going well. You can't make the other person love and sacrifice for you the way you love and sacrifice for them. So what can you do? Well, this psalmist begins by saying that his first step was to go to God, to pray. The opening phrase, I call on the Lord, or I cried to the Lord. The tense of the verb call or cry could be either past or present tense. I cried to the Lord and he answered me, or I call to the Lord, present tense, and he answers me. The verb tenses that are used here are perfect, and so sometimes they can be past tense, or they sometimes can be present tense. But what's clear is that at some point, the author has had a big problem. They went to God with it, and that he dealt with it. And so they now have the confidence to do that with this particular circumstance. And his particular problem was that people were lying about him. what could be the case, and again, we're having to read between the lines here because we don't get the whole story, but it could be that he couldn't go to the feast day because if he leaves and is away for an extended period of time, as it would require to travel to and from Jerusalem and experience the feast days, if he's gone, those lies will just be spread further and further. So he dare not go to Jerusalem for fear that his enemies would say worse things or more things, right? That his absence would do more harm. That's what he may be grappling with here. The lying lips and deceitful tongues very probably is a reference to a false witness. He's involved in some sort of litigation, and someone is testifying falsely about him, about something he said or something he's done or a deal he's entered into, and they're standing up before the court and saying false things about him, telling lies about him, and so he's just caught, exasperated, right? You can stand up in court, and I kind of got into watching and learning about people who were falsely convicted for crimes, some as serious as murder, some who have found themselves on death row, and it comes out that there was a lying witness, or sometimes law enforcement was even involved in framing this person or in hiding evidence that would have been exculpatory, would have proven them innocent. I mean, there's been all sorts of cases, and how difficult it would be. I just find myself putting myself in their shoes. What would you do? I mean, you'd want to scream from the defendant's table, I didn't do this. How can you convict me for something I didn't do? And you can see that frustration in there and hear that frustration when they tell their stories. And that's what's happening with this particular psalmist. What can you do about it? And so he begins by going to God. Secondly, look at verses 3 and 4. What will he do to you? And what more besides, you deceitful tongue? He will punish you with a warrior's sharp arrows and with burning coals of the broom bush. So it's unlikely. It sounds like he's addressing his enemies, right? That he's talking to his enemies. That's pretty unlikely. Maybe this is the answer he got to his prayer from God, that God said he's going to deal with it the way they've dealt with him. So in the Psalms, in poetic literature particularly, sharp arrows and burning coals have to do with lies and malicious speech. Arrows and fires are images of evil, lying words. And so we see these images used frequently in Scripture and throughout the Psalms and Proverbs and Jeremiah. Even James references the power of these images. And so the psalmist is saying that what God is going to do is use their own evil words against them. Maybe somebody else is going to lie about them, or maybe their words will be found out as untrue, and they're going to be punished for that. But in some way, their lying, their saying these falsehoods is going to come back to bite them, right? I talked about burning coals of a broom bush. A broom bush was a common plant in that part of the world. It was noteworthy for travelers because it provides good shade. And so in the middle of the day, you can't just keep going. You've got to find some place to hunker down in the heat of the day. And so travelers would look for these broom bushes and wait out the heat in their shade. Great shade trees. But what they're also known for is that their roots make great charcoal. I like to cook over a grill, and I had a gas grill for a long time, but over the past few years, since just before we moved to Manchester, in fact, I got a charcoal grill, which is the way I remember my dad cooking on a grill when I was a kid. And I just love the flavor. I love the smell of the fire. I love it. I love it all, except for the mess and the time it takes. But I do love cooking on a charcoal grill, and I've gotten to where I'm buying the whole charcoal. Usually it's oak. Sometimes it'll have some mesquite in there, but it'll be actual pieces of charcoal, not the compacted briquettes that I used to buy. And some woods make better charcoal than others, right? And what I've noticed about these natural pieces of charcoal is that they get hot and they stay hot for a long time. That they will, and so sometimes I'll reuse charcoal if I cook for a while and then I come back and there didn't, and when I finish cooking, I kind of cover it up and smother the fire, and can come back next time and reuse some of that charcoal from the last time I cooked. Well, the broom bush has got one of those long burning, hot coals, and so to have charcoal from a broom bush being used against you would have been pretty fearsome. But that's the image of, again, evil, lying words. And so the second thing that we see here that this psalmist acknowledges that he has to do is to trust God. That he can't deal with it. He just has to trust that God is going to be the one to deal with this problem. And sometimes for you and me, and at least for me, I can speak for me for sure, that is a really difficult step. Trusting God is often like the last thing I want to do when a circumstance is spinning out of control. I want to wrap my arms around it or wrap my head around it, whatever, and just work on it and make it better. That is my first inclination. And then when that doesn't work, what I want to do is get real mad and try it again. That's my second step. It's sometimes fifth or sixth steps down the line to realize I can't. I just can't. This is a God alone problem. That is not, by the way, I'm not telling you that's the way you ought to do things. Sometimes when the preacher tells you stories about things he does in his life, it's not a positive example. That is a negative example. And really, we ought to begin with trust in God, that God's going to deal with it in the right way. And sometimes he asks for us to partner with him in that, or leads us in that sort of response. But really trusting in God to deal with these problems that are beyond our ability to cope. That ought to be our first step. And then finally, third step, look at verses 5 through 7. Woe to me that I dwell in Meshech, that I live among the tents of Kedar. Too long have I lived among those who hate peace. I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for war. So what is this step? Well, let's begin by looking at some of these things we may not be familiar with. Meshech was located in Asia Minor. It was to the northwest of Israel. And then Kedar, mentioned the second half of verse 6 there, was a nomadic nation in northern Arabia, which was southeast of Israel. Meshech was a Gentile nation. Kedar were the descendants of Ishmael, Abraham's son by Hagar. Both people were a great distance from Israel, not only physically, like they're thousands of miles apart, but they're also culturally far away from Israel. And so what this author is saying is not literal. because for one, you couldn't live in two places that are thousands of miles apart at the same time, right? And they're both present tense. I dwell, present tense, in Meshech. Well, you could do that, but you could not also live among the tents of Kedar. So what is he's saying with this? He's saying that he was living with Jewish people in Israel who were behaving like people who are not in covenant blessing with God. Any Jew who feared God and the Ten Commandments would not bear false witness against another person, much less a fellow Israelite, right? And so it would be hard to live in an ungodly culture. It would be even more difficult to live in a culture that's supposed to honor God but doesn't. You and I, we have a culture that we live among, the church, that's supposed to be godly, and we also have a culture that we live among that's not godly, right? Just the world that's around us. And it's not easy to live in a non-Christian culture, a world that doesn't believe in God or follow His word. That's difficult enough. But what if the place you're looking for solace and comfort and encouragement? What if the church were living in the exact same sort of way? What if we didn't speak up for God's covenant blessings? What if we didn't live lives that were seeking to follow His paths? Well, that would be really disappointing. And we know this disappointment because it happens sometimes. We have a brother or sister of Christ who just throws their hands up and walks away. And our expectation of them, sometimes even our history with them, has been one of godliness and gentleness and trustworthiness. And we've got these expectations for one another. And when even one person wanders off like that, it's hard. It is. It takes a larger toll on us than just our next door neighbor or someone who we work with doing the exact same thing. What this psalmist is saying is that their expectations of fellow Israelites have been just dashed because they are living like those who are far from God. Sometimes as believers today, we live with other believers who act like unbelievers. The Apostle Paul talked about this on several occasions. He called them, he said, don't live like the Gentiles, right? And by that, he didn't mean have anything, wasn't talking at all about their DNA or their bloodline or their family tree. Rather, he was talking about people who live apart from God. Don't live like people who are apart from God. Or sometimes when they were doing that, he was saying, you are behaving like the Gentiles. So sometimes Paul would shame them by saying that. So the third and the final step would just be to patiently endure, to speak up on behalf of peace, and know that others are going to be calling for war. And that's a really difficult step too, to just patiently endure and wait on the Lord. We continue carrying it to the Lord in prayer, but just waiting for Him and patiently enduring the struggles that we're caught in. Well, I hope that this is, if not an encouragement, at least been educational for you, and hopefully you're not going through struggles like this right now. But if you are, I hope that it's been instructional. So may God bless you and the study of His Word this evening.